I'd like to welcome everybody to this, which is the first of our Republican Labour Autumn Educational Series. And we're beginning with the report on the horrific tragedy of Grenfell Tower. And we're very fortunate to have Emma Dent Coad as our main speaker. Emma was a councillor in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea since 2006. And MP from 2017 to 2019, and an independent councillor since 2023. So that's our main speaker, but we're going to start off with an introduction from Steve Freeman, and then we'll move on to Emma. So I'm going to spotlight you now, Steve, and give the introduction for us.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome, Emma. Just to say to comrades, I met Emma in supporting her election campaign recently, and going over there to help her as much as I could in the election. So it's a great pleasure to have her here to speak to us about this particular topic. My contribution really is to try to make links between this tragedy and our Republican politics as an introduction to Emma's contribution. Obviously, the first thing we need to do, of course, is to recognise that, above all else, this is a human tragedy for the 72 people, including 18 children, who died in this horrific fire. And we must add the suffering of all who survived and continue to suffer trauma, including the firefighters. And, of course, we should add our appreciation to all of those people in the community around Grenfell who have kept this issue alive, and not forgetting the efforts of various individual campaigners, not least Emma in this role. So that's the most important thing above all else I think we need to say before we start delving into politics and different ideas and different theories and all the rest of it. I was going to start with 2 PowerPoints just to sort of show, you know, the angle I want to take. So first thing I wanted to call is, from my angle, the crown and the tragedy of Grenfell. I noticed, by the way, that there are the government has just changed the way of describing itself in those 2 little things on the right. They've changed from the first one, which apparently was Queen Elizabeth, that went back to Edward III, and this later one is apparently a Tudor symbol that Charles has decided to adopt. But anyway, that's by the by. The first thing that I really wanted to simply say, so comrades could see what I'm going to be focusing on, I'll put these 3. I think there are these 3 layers or levels around which we can discuss this tragedy. I was reading an article by Peter Apps in The Guardian recently, and he says, Grenfell is simply explained. Firms chase profits, ministers sat on their hands, innocents paid with their lives. And in a way, that's the 3 levels that I've got in that story, just summed up there. Obviously, I'm going to concentrate my discussion around the question of the crown and what we mean by that, and why we think that is important. Just given that I'm going to focus on that, I'm not going to focus on the very, very important role that the construction industry played, or what was happening to residents and all the rest of it in the community. And the next thing I want to simply, again, to move on from that one, if I can. Here's my, take it again. I've just to emphasize what we mean by the crown. We don't mean the king in the palace, as it were. We understand the crown as a way of describing legally the state itself. It's the sum total of a whole series of organizations, and it has its own logic. But one of the most important, obviously, is the Prime Minister in Downing Street. Central to that, and that's why it's in red, is His Majesty's Treasury. Then we've got the judges, prisons, police. Then we've got Whitehall departments, particularly the Department of Community and Local Government, although it's changed its name now. And then down at the bottom of this story, we've got local authorities, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and the tenant management organisation. These are all actors in this. I mean, just looking at that little map, as it were, Parliament hardly figures in this story at all. The King doesn't figure in it at all. Parliament doesn't figure in it at all. I say doesn't figure in it. There are two reports that Parliament make, select committees, which are reported in the report, and they're more or less ignored, by the way. So Parliament really has no real role to play in this tragedy, and is hardly mentioned except select committees. There's two of that. I haven't got the exact names in front of me right now, but that's that. So the whole central part of this story. Second point I want to make about this is one of the key institutions for understanding how the Crown operates is the Treasury. If we don't understand how the Treasury works, its arm, its influence extends over the whole of Whitehall. It's a very, very powerful body directly connected to the Bank of England, the city. Now, it's not discussed in this report either. So, nevertheless, what's going on in the Department of Communities, local government, what's going on in the local authorities is being influenced by this very important body. Now I'm going to leave my PowerPoint, Carol, stop sharing at this point and come back to my main points. But that's the framework of where I want to focus my attention. Just again, making the point that we often relate the king, the monarch, to the crown as if they're the same thing. And what we have been doing is separating them out so that we can look at them differently. They're obviously connected, by the way. It's not like they're not connected to one another. We couldn't have a crown if we didn't have a king. If a king went, what the hell would this all be? It'll fall apart. So there's a deep connection between them, but they're not the same thing. So the first real point I wanted to make was to use a term that John McDonnell used in 2017 when he spoke about something called a case of social murder. That caused a lot of controversy at the time. He's referencing a term that Engels used in 1845, which Engels, when he was talking about the condition of the working class in England, refers to a class which at present holds social and political control and places hundreds of proletarians in a position that they inevitably meet a too early or an unnatural death. And he used the term social murder, and John McDonnell used that term, and he came back with it again, by the way, recently when he's commenting on the current report. I mean, if any of us had taken a can of petrol and set fire to Grenfell Tower, we would have been arrested, tried, and be languishing in jail for murder. Yet here we are 7 years later and nobody's been arrested. We hear that the Metropolitan Police are going to look into it and have promised to do something in about 2 years' time, maybe. So there is clearly a class dimension, both to those who died and to the kind of justice that is happening. I'm speculating that we should perhaps call it a case of corporate manslaughter, meaning there's an organizational or institutional responsibility for social murder. It's not simply a matter of individual agents acting with negligence, dishonesty, incompetence, whether that's on a building site, a workplace, or a block of flats. But there's a collective responsibility, not simply individuals. And if that was the correct title, and I would say that the correct title for this corporate body is the Crown. And I'll come back and say why I think that is clear. But there is no corporate body called the government or indeed the British state. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So the Crown should be in court. It's being sued for corporate manslaughter. But I'm not a lawyer, so I probably got that all wrong. I think Emma might be a lawyer. I'm not sure. So if I am wrong, she'll put me on the right track. But anyway, the purpose of this meeting is not simply to describe the facts, which are widely known. And we're known. We all knew about it back in 2017. We didn't know the details. We were understood back then. It's analysis to understand why. This is where fact and theory comes together to illuminate the truth from fiction. It's a very detailed report, but I might ask myself, does it constitute a cover-up by making us look in the wrong direction? what we are doing. Now, I think I wanted to go back to start the story by going back to 1991. 1991 is the first date in the report. Yeah, 1991 is where there was a fire at Knowsley Heights, which I think is in Liverpool, and that's the first one identified in this report. The report then speaks about a period between 1991 and the fire at Grenfell Tower in 2017, when there were, it says, many opportunities for the government to identify the risks posed by the use of combustible cladding panels and insulation, particularly in high-rise buildings, and take action in relation to them. But nothing was done. Nothing was done. 1991 is a very important date for us too, because that was the year when Tony Benn was drafting his Commonwealth Bill, which he would present to the Commons in 1992. The principal aim of this bill was to end the powers of the Crown. Benn's idea was of a Commonwealth that can be understood as a community for the common good of its members or citizens. It's a democratic state dedicated to the health, welfare, and we could say safety of its citizens. I don't know if your comrades remember the discussion. Jennifer thought we were a miserable bunch and we needed to include happiness, as in from the US Constitution. So we should have health, welfare, safety, and indeed lots of happiness. But anyway, that's the idea that we have developed from and we've been promoting in our own manifesto recently. And of course, Ben didn't invent the idea of a Commonwealth. It has its own origins in the Civil War and the Democratic Revolution in the 1640s. And you can also say we had a version of it after 1945 as a result of the community created by the war amongst the civilian and amongst the army. But anyway, of course, we're not living in a Commonwealth. We're in a regime based on the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament, and this is not a democratic state, and it's not dedicated to the health, welfare, safety of its citizens, and certainly not our happiness. The human tragedy of social murder that took place on the 14th of June brought home the simple fact we are living in a state that is the very opposite of a modern Commonwealth as conceived by Tony Benn. And I think if we remember that this situation, when we remember all of the other examples, by the way, which we could bring into the story, we could mention Bloody Sunday, we could mention Hillsborough, we could mention inflected blood scandal, we could mention the post office scandal, we could mention the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 and Orgreave and the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence and the post office scandal. When we start to look, when we begin to look at all what's going on in all these cases, the similarities are there. It's not a coincidence that the similarities, because they're all emanating from this rather secretive and unaccountable power at the core of the state. Now, we could ask ourselves whether this report is a cover-up or a whitewash. I mean, in one sense, no, because it forensically gathers facts and evidence and information and makes them public. It's very critical of the department. It spells out that these deaths were entirely unnecessary and preventable. And it exposes what's going on in the government to some extent and the construction industry. But cover-up is more than the direction. The cover-up is more than just simply presenting facts. It's where it leads you towards, what conclusions it leads you to draw. And it doesn't lead us to democratic conclusions in any sense at all from this. If we ask what has failed, was it the government, is it the state or the Crown? Well, when you read the executive summary, it says the path to disaster, says the part played by government in the form of the Department of Communities and Local Government in the development of statutory guidance and so on and so forth. Your focus is really on this one department. In the subsection headed government, he also he basically focused his attention on that. The report does identify that the building research establishment set up in 1921 was privatized in 1997, and that had a disastrous impact on the whole story. Now he's talking about government. Government doesn't work for this. When Theresa May spoke about it in 2017, she talked about the failure of the state. She said the state had failed. And when Keir Starmer spoke in the House of Commons, he apologised on behalf of the British state. He mentioned other occasions then that the state had failed. So we're going from, is it the government, is it the state that's failed? That's a kind of fundamental argument. Rishi Sunak, when he spoke in the Commons, said that that it was the state. He said, as a prime minister, current and former, you are the custodian of the state and its failures, whether you watch or not, you feel deeply. And at the end of it, I want to extend my deepest apologies to the families and victims of Grenfell. The state let you down and must never do so again. Robert Jenrick said, it's an unmitigated tragedy and a comprehensive failure by the British state. The problem really in all of this is that the state is not really what is failing. What is failing is the Crown. And I think that the Crown isn't mentioned. I thought the Crown isn't mentioned in this report. And I'll just end on this point, Carol, with a little bit of conclusion. When I looked at the footnotes at the beginning, who called this meeting, under what laws was it called, who appointed Sir Martin to do this, and I looked at the footnotes, and there's a little piece in the footnotes that says, and this is the first time I hear the word Crown appear anywhere in the report. In the opening pages, it refers to the OGL, which is the Open Government License for publications and reproductions. And it says in this that behind this is the keeper of the public records, which has the authority to license information subject to copyright and database right owned by the Crown. So quite clear, when we're talking about information, the correct legal term is to say that information is owned by the Crown as a concept, as a legal and political and moral concept. Now, I'm going to stop here because I think we need to maybe look more in discussion, but I'm going to end up, I think, by simply saying this, and I can just draw a conclusion from this. The Crown in Parliament, the political system, the Parliament played no role. The Crown in Parliament is neither a democracy nor a commonwealth dedicated to the health, welfare and safety and happiness of its subjects. And since Thatcher and the 2007 banking crisis, there has been a growing crisis of democracy. The social murder in Grenfell Tower must be seen as part of a crisis of democracy because there was no democracy for the residents. And I think that we on the left have for a long time ignored the idea of Crown and Crown power, which Tony Benn put before us. Many people think that maybe the answer to our problems is proportional representation, but if you think about it, that would not have solved any of these problems. We need something much deeper, something more democratic, and something more cultural in how we make sure that tragedies like this don't occur again, because they are recurring on many, many levels. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'd now like to invite Emma Dent Coad to give her talk on the Grenfell disaster. And Emma is eminently qualified to do this, as I explained in the introduction. So Emma, over to you.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Steve. I'm still a bit unclear about state and the Crown, to be perfectly honest. I'll have to have a long think about that. But there we are. I'll give you a little bit of background on my my arrival where I am, really, I suppose. I've been a Republican for quite some time. I joined when Prince Harry wore the Nazi uniform. That was quite some years ago. I thought it was just absolutely disgusting thing for any member of the royal family to do. I joined then, I was on the board for some time. And then when I became a councillor, I just stepped down from the board and became an ordinary member. So I've been a member of Republic for many years. And we are well overdue. And I was saying before we started, what a brilliant job the royal family are doing to themselves to abolish themselves with the pervy uncles and thoroughly unpleasant people involved, and the racism and heaven knows what else. For the record, just after Grenfell, I was down at the site. I was talking to some of the firefighters, and the police commissioner came over and said, "Oh, the Queen is visiting one of the rescue centres. If you'd like to meet her, would be honoured to walk you through the crowds to meet her." And I said, "Well, that's lovely, but I think the firefighters need me more." So I missed my opportunity to meet the Queen. I would do that again. And I'll be honest, some of the people who met her were very touched that she'd come down, and she'd spent quite a long time talking to them. And I never forgotten that she made the effort. As we know, she was truly empathic. She didn't have to go on a course to learn empathy. I have some respect for how she dealt with people, if not her actual role. And just the final nail in the coffin for the current king for me was hearing 2 bars of his new hymn for whatever it was. Oh, it was for the death of his mother, the Queen. He'd commissioned a new hymn, and it was full of these and thous and the most awful language, archaic language. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly where we are. We are stuck in the olden days with these people. I don't want anything to do with them. Time for them to go. To give you a bit of background on before I became MP, on why I was very well qualified, I'd been fighting the fire cuts with the Fire Brigades Union as a councillor, because they were trying to close some of our fire stations, and working with the GLA members and the Fire Brigades Union. We managed to save, I think, they will never give you credit, the North Ken fire station, which was the first station on the site of the night of the fire. So that was from about 2012 we were fighting the fire cuts. And because of my work there, I was invited on to the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, which was the committee, or the authority I should say, which was in charge between 2016 and 17 of implementing Boris Johnson's fire cuts, and writing to ministers about the Lakanal House. We were particularly focused on the findings of the Lakanal House inquest and why the government hadn't implemented them. So that was my year at LFIPA. I stepped down as soon as I was surprisingly elected as MP, and then the fire happened shortly afterwards, as you know. So I was very well qualified in a way, and I have a background in built environment. I actually knew some of the architects involved in building Grenfell Tower and many of our other 1960s and 70s social housing in Kensington, because of my history background. So I arrived in Parliament very surprised, obviously, but also quite well qualified, and I kind of knew what they'd done to that building, which they shouldn't have done, and why the fire had spread. And then none of them was in the least bit interested. As you can imagine, I was representing the little people. I was a crazed lefty, and they didn't want me anywhere near them. People like Robert Jenrick coming up with his fine words. He was absolutely repellent towards me. He was so rude and obnoxious. I don't want to hear a word from that man. But there we go. And I particularly focused, I've been reading the report in bits. I particularly focus, and this may not be the bits that you're most interested in, but that's what I'm going to talk about. So you can ask me about other things afterwards if you like. I was most interested because of my experience on the council from 2006, on what had happened in the TMO, which I was on from 2008 to 12. As I was leaving, they just agreed to spend some money on Grenfell Tower, and everybody was delighted, and had anything to do with the decisions afterwards, which periodically comes up, and I get death threats and police protection again. It's not true. It's been proved. So the TMO and the actions of the council, or the lack of actions of the council. And this is really the story that we're all very, very aware of course, that social tenants calling for help. And I knew some of the Grenfell Action Group before the fire, and all their letters to the TMO and to the council, calling for help and a bit of scrutiny on what was happening in the building as they were being refurbed. And calling to cease and desist letters and so on. Absolutely disgraceful. What happens when the little people call for help? Obviously global corporations, as we know, are protected and indeed rewarded, and they're still being rewarded. So that's a tough one. You may or may not know that I wrote a book about it. After I lost my seat in 2019, I was ill, I had cancer. I'm good now. And I was stuck at home because of COVID for quite a while. And I wrote a book about my years on the council and all the things that had happened. And having been a journalist for a long time, I keep notes of every single meeting I go to. So it was written really from contemporaneous notes and my perceptions of what had gone on. So it was kind of fresh, even though obviously I was writing from the past, but my notes were fresh and they were, as I said, written contemporaneously. And some of the awful quotes and things that people had said in the council about social tenants and so on, it's all in there and it's good information. So, so my book, One Kensington, I may be writing another one, I'm not quite sure yet, thinking about it, of what has happened since 2019, because the council is still behaving appallingly. So I was, there's quite a lot of information in the report about fire enforcement notices going to the TMO, some of which it was in my ward. I moved wards, but in my ward at the time, in 2015, there was a fire. And we knew that the local fire brigade, of course, I was quite familiar with because I've been working with them for quite a while, had been serving enforcement notices on the sister block of Adair Tower and telling them to do various things to the building, which they hadn't done. And they'd been fined for one building, and then they hadn't done the work on the other building on Adair Tower. And luckily, everyone self-evacuated. It was smoke rather than fire that was the main problem there. But people were terrified, and they managed to get out of the building in one piece, if not while terrified. But there's a lot of stuff about that, and about all the fire enforcement notices that were ending up in a certain person's drawer. They weren't being shared with the board at the time. And while I was reading it, I got a slight preview. I was allowed to go in at 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning and spend 3 hours with the report, which I then took away. While I was reading it, the information about the officers that hid those fire enforcement notices and what that led to, and it was the same story with Grenfell and the door closers and all the rest of it. Reading that in black and white and reading their emails and how they'd covered up actually drew me to tears of anger. I was so angry. I was crying with fury. I was livid. I had to take a break and walk up and down the corridor because I felt murderous myself, actually. But there you are. What will happen to all of them? You know, we shall see, shan't we? I disagree, actually, with Steve. I do think, from what I've read a lot about corporate manslaughter, and I've read a lot about gross negligence manslaughter. And there are certain people in the report that I've read so far, I haven't read the whole thing, who I think really stand out as potentially responsible, chargeable of gross negligence manslaughter. And if they are, and if that sticks, they could go to jail. And I think they must. So there are certain people who I think are personally responsible. They made decisions. They decided not to share information which could have saved lives. They were making life or death decisions. They knew exactly what they were doing, decided to conceal the information. And that, in my knowledge, and I'm not a lawyer, thank you for that, I've just got a busy brain, but I'm not a lawyer. But from what I've read, I think that could constitute gross negligence manslaughter, and they personally could go to jail, but we shall see. Of course, you know, the people responsible I've been calling all week for the last week, and it has been a really tough week. I won't pretend that, you know, I tried not to turn any press requests down, but I turned down many, including Andrew Marr. I just didn't have time or the emotional energy, to be frank. But I've been calling for the resignation from the Lords. You can't sack people from the Lords, of all those people responsible. Lord Pickles, number one, a despicable human being. Lord Barwell, number 2. Cameron, definitely 100%. And I can't remember who I had a couple of others on my list. They should have the good grace to step down. If the Lords means anything, they should step down. And what sickens me currently, is a bit of a side issue, is that the Labour government is planning on removing all the hereditary Lords, which in theory is a perfectly decent decision. But some of them are actually really good. I've been working with Lord Lytton on some of the amendments to the Building Safety Act and the Leasehold Reform Act and so on, and he's really good. He's a chartered surveyor. He knows his stuff. So are we going to get rid of Lord Lytton and keep Cameron and Pickles? That's what we're going to do. And that, there's no discretion on that as far as I can see. Let's just see. So, the people responsible for this, all these bad decisions, go to hell via the Lords, and the people affected burn to death, and they go to heaven, obviously. We have a lot of angels in my area. And indeed, they have been failed by the state. There was a film made by a group of local people soon after the fire called Failed by the State. It was absolutely brilliant, and it was talking about local people rather than the media doing reports, which there have been some very, very good and very in-depth reports. So I just want to go through a few of the things that I picked up in the report recently, and I'm sure Steve will link it back to the ladies of the Crown, the state, or whatever. That's your job. But let me just talk about some of the things. One of the things that a lot of us are upset about is the fact that racism, which we see very, very clearly in a lot of the decisions that's been going on for a long time. We just had a past mayor disciplined for making a awful racist comment, which we only just heard about last week. And he's still there. What the hell is he still on the council for? And they said that's outside the terms of reference. It shouldn't be outside the terms of reference. And I'm sorry that Morbeck, who to start with I thought was going to be awful, but actually he's been kind where he should be kind, and he's been robust where he should be robust. And I was by chance there the day that Lord Pickles arrived, and he certainly gave him a talking to when he said he had a lunch date and can we get on with it? It's disgusting. So there is the racism thing we're concerned about. Yeah, and obviously there's shortcomings in the construction industry, and they're more extensive than had been envisaged, and that comes out so clearly in the report. We knew what was going on. We saw what was going on. My background in the built environment, and I've been talking to all the professional organisations. Many of them have held their hands up. So we're doing this, this, and this, and I get reports. I get updates once a year from there's about 15 professional organisations. Everybody from the Royal Institute of British Architects to the Construction Industry Training Board, who oversee the training of construction professionals and so on. And everybody in between. They send me updates every year, and I send them to MPs for their debate. They don't read them, but they've got them. I want them to have good information. So a lot of people have held their hands up and say we failed and we must do better, and that's something. It's something. So there are a few things that I was concerned about. I mean, the building control, the head of building control at the council has got hammering. It's grossly unfair. His budget was cut by, I think, 2/3, and his workload went up 2 or 3 times. He couldn't cope. And I think that was grossly unfair. It was the council who cut his budget to buggery, and that's disgraceful, actually. But of course, we have all the lies about the building control certificates from outside the council, and of course the fire tests and so on. Which is, the more you read, I knew about all the fire tests, but reading it in detail, it makes it even worse. It makes it so much worse. There's of course, the relationship between the TMO that was managing these buildings and the residents of Grenfell Tower, and I saw this, and I'm glad it's been named, characterized by distrust, dislike, personal antagonism, and anger. The problem is, it still is. Residents still aren't getting a good service from the council. They're still not funding the housing management department as it is now, to the extent it should be. And then they call out the persistent indifference to fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people. And as we know, there were a number, I can't remember the number now, disabled people who died. And I've heard some terrible, frightening stories of what happened on the night, which I won't go into because I can't even use the words, but you can read it for yourself if you want. There is then, of course, the response, the council's response, and we knew what was going on then. It was horrific. I was down there on the night. I couldn't see anybody from the council. During the day, there was one housing officer stuck in one of the rescue centres. She was on her knees, and she was doing her best. That was the only officer I saw all day. Absolutely shocking. And it says the response of government and RBKC was muddled, slow, indecisive, and piecemeal, marked by a lack of respect for human decency and dignity. And I do welcome those words from Morbic. He got it, I think. I was also at the time speaking to Gold Command, the head of Gold Command, who took over early within about 5 days, who took over and was horrified about the lack of response by the council, and the chief exec, who was incapable and had said he'd been ordered by the government to go down to see what was going on. And he said, "I'm not going down there. It's like little Africa." And that was reported by somebody I have no reason to disbelieve. Absolutely disgusting. At the same time, incidentally, I'd caused a major upset by winning. Kensington had gone red and all this absolute nonsense. I'm a socialist and I look after all communities, and that's why I won, because the people all over the place, including South Ken, had voted for me because I support everybody. And that was my point, really. But I had suddenly become a dangerous woman, and I said to the head of Gold Command, I'm clearly absolutely paranoid, but I think I've been followed by MI5 or something. I don't know. What is it? What are they, are they following me? What's going on? Because I'm being followed. And it's not only the gutter press who are also following me. And he said, just be careful, which was very frightening. And I know in the run up to the election, I was being observed as well. So I'm a dangerous woman, and you know what? I embrace that because I think it's my job to ask the questions and to go where they don't want me to go. So there we go. There's an awful lot about the culpability of the council and particular individuals on the council, their lack of training and their lack of, within the council, their lack of taking fire safety seriously. And there's been, I don't know if anyone saw, there was a report in the Times last week, which I don't subscribe to, but someone sent it to me, about a fire safety officer who'd been pretty much shoved out of his job because this is now, because he was too concerned about lack of fire safety in certain buildings. And I've spoken to the gentleman concerned, and he said there are still unsafe buildings in Kensington, Chelsea, and that's unforgivable. So that's, you know, they haven't got any better. They're not putting money where it needs to be. And if they say they can't afford it, they had just spent £10 million extending one of our lovely museums. It's very beautiful, but that £10 million could have been spent on making our tower blocks safe, and they decided not to. They spent it on extending Leighton House, which is all very beautiful, but there are things which are more needed. It's pretty disgusting. Am I okay for time? Am I going over? Am I all right?
Yes, okay, yep.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So there's, I mean, there are some very good conclusions and recommendations in there. Some of them, they don't go far enough in the report, as far as I'm concerned. As I said, I've been working with all the different parts of the built environment, and I will continue to do that. They can't stop me doing that. No one's paying me for it. I'm speaking at endless events. I think I got paid once. I spoke at architecture school, and surprisingly, they sent me £150 or something. But that's about it. You know, I'm a backbench counsellor, and as long as I can pay my bills, that's fine, because this needs to be dealt with. And if I have a particular insight on some issues, then it's my job to do that, really. So yeah, some of the conclusions I thought were very good. As I said, I mean, some of the corporations have been accused of deliberate dishonesty, and that will be, I presume, potential corporate manslaughter. The issue is, I think one of the many reasons, this is my personal view, one of the many reasons that it's taken so long, I think, is these global corporations have so much money to sink in their legal defense that the police have to be 1,000% sure. They have to have dotted every I, crossed every T 5 times over, because the legal defense of these global corporations will be terrifying, as indeed is that of the council. And you know what? The council have put their hands up and said, we failed, and we're really sorry, and boo-hoo, and they do the sad face thing, and say how marvelous our communities are. You know what? Our communities are still marvelous. They were marvelous before. They're marvelous now. They shouldn't have to be that marvelous, because the council should put more money into local services, and they know that. We tell them all the time. But the minority party councillors, of which there are 13, not all Labour now, 8 Labour, and then various others, have been telling them for a very long time, and will continue to fight. But when it comes to votes, we are always outvoted, which is a bit of an aberration, really, of democracy. So there we are. They have, yeah. So we shall see. I mean, when we talked at the beginning, Steve was talking about John McDonnell, who I remained in contact with. I see him periodically. His comments about social murder all those years ago. In fact, as it happened, I messaged him last week after I'd read bits of the report, and I said, I always balked at using that term, but having read the bits I've read now, you're absolutely right. It's social murder. It was social murder. It was deliberate. They had knowledge of what they were doing. And they did it anyway, because the little people don't count. And here, and I know it's not exclusive to here, around the country, but they should be doing better here. Nothing has changed as far as I'm concerned, and most of my residents tell me that. I live very near the tower, and I see people every other day who talk about it. So what's the new government going to do? We shall have to see. Jury's out. I've heard lots of lovely speeches, and I've been hearing lovely speeches for 7 years. I'm fed up with lovely speeches. I want an action plan with a timeline, and somebody overseeing it and saying, oh, we've done that bit, we'll go back to do this bit now. That bit has got a bit slowed down, we're going to have to do this. My fear is, there's a complete vacuum of politics. All I'm hearing from the government now is about the economy and how they're going to grow it by starving children, freezing old people to death, and so on and so forth. All those hateful decisions they're making right now, which aren't going to help anybody. And there's no political vision or hope. And so that their position really is not people-centric at all, which is the last thing you'd expect from a Labour government of any kind. So we shall see. Jury's out on that, but I'm clearly not in the least bit optimistic. I'd been feeling very uncomfortable in the Labour Party for quite some time. There were 2 things last year that made me resign finally. One of them was Diane Abbott being suspended for saying something stupid, which she apologised for, and it was a mistake. Some people have said far worse things and done far worse things. Of people sitting on the front bench who should probably be in jail. There was that. And then in the same week, the news that Keir Starmer, who loves free tickets for things, had accepted hospitality from Mullally, a company which had refused to remediate some of its towers down in Southampton and had been fined £10 million for it. And he accepted, I think it was something like £1,000 for football tickets. It accepted £1,000 worth of football tickets from Mullally. And I had people calling me all day, what the hell is your leader doing? That was the point at which I was leader of the Labour group at the time, a Labour group of 13. There's now 8. That was the point at which I couldn't stand it a minute longer, and I resigned overnight. So that's what I think about them. We shall see. Jury's out. If they do a good job, I'll praise them for it. I'm not expecting anything. But let's see. There's 600,000 people out there waiting in unsafe homes, waiting for the government to step up and actually look after them, make sure they're safe. And they're not sleeping, especially after Dagenham, especially after reading bits of the report. And their first responsibility, everybody's responsibility, is for those 600,000 people. And everybody in my patch are also thinking about them and praying, if they pray, for all those people to be safe in their beds, because there could be Grenfell 2 tonight, and that's unforgivable. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Emma. Yeah, Grenfell 2 tonight. That's a terrifying thought, isn't it? Could I just ask you, you mentioned your book. Is there any way that you can put the link to your book in the chat for us?
Okay.
That would be lovely if we could have the link to your book.
Thank you.
What immediately came to mind when you were talking about the legal the legal backing that these global corporations and the council will have. When you mentioned that, I immediately thought of Tony Benn's marvelous idea of having a legal national system. Like we have a national health system, we should have a national legal system where everyone has equal access to the law. And that is one of the things that we put in our manifesto. It's really, really unacceptable that people have no access to the law. It's too expensive. It's put there for people with lots and lots of money, and the little person really has a job fighting in the system that we have. Anyway, I'll say no more. I know that Malcolm Malay wants to speak, so I'm going to bring Malcolm in first, and then I'm going to bring in Phil Vellender. So Malcolm, are you ready to speak?
What happened at Grenfell was, of course, lots of failures, but the main failure was to do with the building regulations, which is a very important. Building regulations are in fact the law of the land. They are the law. But I suppose it all goes back, well, shall we say it all goes back to Thatcher. I mean, it's all to do with privatization and lack of funds. I mean, the building regulation, you have to get building regulation approval for any project. And this is, of course, a lot of work for the people doing it. Well, they can farm it out, but they need money to farm it out to competent people. So they don't have enough money to do building regulation approval. And I mean, the report is very long and very, very detailed and all detailed about the actual cladding and so on. But as mentioned, I think by Steve, the Building Research Station, which was a government-funded independent research station doing research without any commercial pressure, has been privatized. And as it says in the report, the Building Research Station is no longer viable in that sense. And there's a whole lot of stuff about the fire test. I mean, fire tests, inbuilt fire is a lot. Building regulations have a lot to do with fire, but fire is very complicated for all sorts of reasons. And to get the various categories of your building materials, you have to do fire tests, which are extremely expensive to do. So the manufacturers of the cladding sort of did all sorts of underhand things to sort of get themselves not really accredited, but the building regulation people don't have enough.
Yeah, well, the manufacturers weren't short of money, though, Malcolm. They could have spent any amount of money if they wanted. They chose to save money on all of these issues. They chose.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying there isn't money available.
They weren't running out of money. Neither was the council. The council had 150. What was it? 200 million, 250 million, I think it was, in reserves, which they could have spent on this if they'd chosen to. And they chose. I mean, here it wasn't a question of money. Some places it is. It was their choices, their priorities.
No, but I mean, what was happened at Grenfell was the building regulations weren't properly applied. I mean, either because the people who were supposed to apply them were incompetent, and also because they were up against, and they should know they were up against, completely dishonest subcontractors or suppliers of material.
Yeah, also, yeah, I mean, the project management, they save money on project management by getting the director of housing to project manage, and she had never project managed anything in her life before. So it was saving money all the way, plus, as you say, incompetence. But some of the things they did to that building were outrageous. As soon as that fire happened, I had people, including one of the architects of the estate, sending me the original plans. It was originally planned with 2 staircases. It was, there were all kinds of other things they planned, and it was over-engineered. It was built so solidly after Ronan Point collapse. It was almost pretty much over-engineered to remain, super solid and to last forever. And then what they did to it, as we know, they turned it into a sieve through which fire could pass. So it was a combination of all kinds of things.
Well, as far as I know, the original fire escape systems in the building weren't adequate, probably, and also they weren't maintained properly. I mean, I don't know how much money. I would imagine Kensington has plenty of money, but most councils, I think, have over the years skimped on building control, as it's normally called, which is making sure that the application of the building regulations actually takes place. But at Grenfell, I mean. I'm so sorry,
but we're now up to over 3 minutes. So, and we've got other.
Okay, it all goes back to privatisation. Really.
Yeah.
And I mean, the person who's fingered in this is of course Cameron and Pickles and I think red tape and all the rest of it. And Pickles saying it's not going to apply to building regulations, and he said that didn't happen. So the whole, and of course, as somebody pointed out, it was sort of cheap cladding on working class towers. So.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm going to bring in Phil Bellender now.
I just wanted to say that there's a sort of hypostatic overarching theme here, which we need to, I think, bring in, which is the question of the purpose of inquiries. And if we go back in time, and Emma quite rightly spoke about some early ones, and Steve or Emma, I think, mentioned them. It's intriguing because I was listening to The World at One yesterday, which is not a program I listen to often, but now and again I pick it up. And they had the Institute of Government had somebody on there, and they then brought on the barrister that ran the inquiry into the Staffordshire hospital disaster where children died, babies were killed. Now, he made several recommendations. He counted them out. I think it was 12 or so, of which none have been ever enacted. Starmer gave no undertaking at the end of this business in the Commons on Wednesday that he'd actually be actioning the recommendations. You have to go through these inquiries and analyze carefully how many of the recommendations have been turned into law. Now, the reason why they don't get turned into law is because of the Crown. The Crown operates to protect those that Emma met up with in the Grenfell disaster, be they council members, be they CEOs of companies, be they police, be they fire chiefs, it's all part of what we call the network of the Crown. And it's perfectly well distinct from in some regards from the state, because this is the day-to-day running of informal networks as well as formal ones. People move, like you'll see Alan Milburn's back in the health ministry now. He slipped off to make 8 million quid in the last 3 years as a health consultant, whatever that is. But it's that mobile morass, I would say putrid morass of corruption, which guarantees that these things happen. And that is why the Crown exists. Now, we've got Crown inquiries coming out of our ears. And the results, when we look at these scandals, which they are, they don't arrive from nowhere. They arrive from the fact that abuses are permitted and facilitated, because the Crown is a network, as I've said, of people and institutions bodies of the state, if you like, which collaborate together and they operate to help one another. Some of them are Masonic, some of them aren't, some of them are just supporters of different parties, but they operate to support this kind of ongoing lack of accountability. And as Steve quite rightly said, we don't live in a democracy. Therefore, dwelling on what the Lords, in my opinion, what the Lords does or doesn't do, what Labour does or doesn't do, it's a government, they are functions, they have powers, but they don't exercise the real power of the government. The government as an executive force operates in number 10 and in the civil service, and they will decide how much of this gets carried out. And I can give you I'll give you a bet on this. Grenfell will result in no one going to jail. I don't believe that's the purpose of this inquiry, or indeed what the police are going to do. Because I know families have been involved in deaths in police custody, and not one police officer has ever gone to jail. Only one up in Leeds or in 1969. The rest of the 1,700 and so have never ever gone to jail. And I want to conclude by just saying that the purpose of these inquiries is what I describe as long grass syndrome. It's the idea that the public rightly feels angered, the public rightly feels a cry for justice, and they're designed to diffuse that. That's what the British state has always done. William Pitt the Younger said, "We know when to take the kid gloves off." And equally, we try and avoid following you around, Emma, is a terrible thing. But the state tends to want to avoid having people feeling that they're being in jail, although we know of a case just recently or two where that has happened, where there's been no charge or anything, just been slammed in jail by a seemingly secret police force. But generally, the British state is like in empire. They always try to mediate it through bureaucrats and things like that. So to conclude, I would say, I doubt very much anyone is going to go to jail over this. Certainly not the dreadful Lord Barwell, who is quite the most disgusting piece of human refuse I've ever had the pleasure of talking to. And I disguised that I was a socialist and spoke to him very politely. But I said to him, "Oh, by the way, I used to live in Lacanau House. Do you remember that one?" And he looked really shifty. He thought, who am I talking to here? And I said, no, I was just amazed that there was such a good report about it. And I left it at that. I didn't say what else I thought. But I said I was very impressed with the report. He gave a talk in the Commons about Lacanau House, and he said it was nothing to do with him. He claimed afterwards that he'd left the position in the Department of Housing, whatever it is. He left 2 years or sometime previously, so it wasn't his business. But they'll do this with Windrush, to finish, sorry. They'll do this with Windrush. We were promised compensation in Windrush 6 months, by the end of 6 months afterwards. Rudd promised that there would be compensation. Nothing's been done about that. And lastly, the Kenyan veterans. That was the best one. The Crown uses inquiries to delay, to obfuscate, and hopefully people will just die off. That's the goal. So don't look for justice from the Crown. You won't get it.
There's a question in there, which is, what is the purpose of inquiries? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. I've been talking to Inquest, who are pushing through, and they've been talking to government regularly about the prevention of future deaths, and their campaign No More Deaths. And I was on whatever it was on Channel 4 the other day with Deborah Coles from Inquest. They are pushing through basically, if recommendations which can save lives are not implemented and future deaths occur, that this could be made a crime, as it should be, as it should indeed be, because as we all know, if the Lacanau House recommendations have been implemented, Grenfell couldn't have happened. So this is a major push. They're using all the lawyers of the land that they can get their hands on, and talking to government. And the prevention of future deaths, I do think is that I'm not that pessimistic. I do think people will go to jail. I think they have to. Maybe I'm closer to it than other people. Have speaking to all the different organisations involved. I had not been sucked up by what the government is saying, but I think there's an awful lot of pressure on them on this particular issue. It's the first big hurdle to effective government that they're facing. They have to get this right. And I do think people go to jail. And I'm relatively confident, not soon, but at some point, that the whole issue about inquiries and what inquiries are for, and how their recommendations can be implemented, I do think that will be resolved in time. There's enough people doing it, and I welcome a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. I've got Mike and then Richard Chilvers. Mike.
Emma, excuse me, I'm a little hoarse from Saturday. I do hope you're right with regard to the people who need to go to jail going there, but I suspect, I'm afraid, that I tend to err on the side of Phil's position insofar as those, particularly those most ultimately responsible, will wheedle their way out of it. I mean, just an aside, by the way, on the whole question of the state, I'll come at it from another angle. There we were, all 125,000 or more of us on Saturday on the last march for Palestine, which now includes, of course, the West Bank, not just Gaza, what's happening, and marching into your borough. And something which epitomized the state was on our left as we went through. It was almost kind of bizarre in its kind of Baroque crenellation, which was the Albert Memorial. My Lord, it's all there. It's this combination of you know, imperial might, extreme wealth, kind of a range of connections, a range of sort of dodgy, you know, sort of old boy networks, and all the rest of it, which we know continues to this day. And you know, they get things done one way or the other, formally, informally. They get things done to ensure that they are safe, and that anybody who goes after them, like you, Emma, experienced, you know, you get your collar touched, as you did. And you know, who knows? There's been times when I've been concerned that my phone has made funny clicks in the past. But just, yeah, going back to the whole question of those ultimately responsible, I do note that, okay, Pickles came into it a little bit, but really, you know, the architects of this ultimately, Cameron and Osborne, managed to get pretty free. Cameron caused huge outrage just in the last day or so by, idiot that he is, an arrogant, you know, complacent fool that he is, claiming that you know, the inquiry had exonerated him. They clearly did not go far enough, and that was presumably, you know, it would have been dangerous to have done so, because, you know, the environment of deregulation is precisely created by those people, and Tony Blair did his share back before them to soften the ground, Blair, Mandelson, and so on. And, you know, again, the Blairs sort of been looking slightly uncomfortable around all of this. So, I mean, Malcolm, you know, if you deregulate like that, if you create troughs, then snouts will appear in them, and people will behave in a disgusting fashion. It's as night follows day. That's what will occur. But, you know, when the proverbial hits the fan, as it really did, you know, I was driving to see a client as part of my work when the news hit. I heard it on the car radio. I had to pull in. I was truly shocked. I really was. And, you know, it just made me late to see my client. I didn't care. It was truly something. And then For 48 hours. You said you hardly saw a person from the royal borough, you know, not any old borough, royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They were damn quiet, though apparently the leader of the council said something at 6:30 that morning when he heard that he didn't want to get extra help because that would make them look like they weren't coping. Well, they didn't do sod all anyway. Government, Theresa May, absolute bloody silence from government from 48 hours. I have to say, you know, it's one of Jeremy Corbyn's finest moments. He just went there and he hugged people and he showed empathy. And that was really quite something. And Sadiq Khan, you know, followed it up with activity, if not the same level of empathy. But, you know, these people were, you could see them trying to find an angle to get themselves off any immediate hook and to find ways of getting, you know, being able to dispel the immediate anger that follows something such as this. You know, there was a real cause there, you know, the ridiculous false messages that caused riots to happen. There was a real cause for people to get on the streets immediately after that. It was so really shocking. So the establishment was trying to buy time to find ways, to find a strategy for getting out of this. And I think all that Phil says about, you know, these sort of commissions is absolutely right. You know, what have they really done in terms, any of them, you know, whether it's Orgreave, whether it's, you know, any of these inquiries, Windrush still going on, you know, they will not be they will not really recompense anybody. As many people as possible will die before anything happens, and only token gestures will be made. And that's why these sort of inquiries are never going to be Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike.
I mean, obviously I agree with a lot of what he was saying. Yeah, that's all I can say, really. I mean, David Cameron has still got a house around the corner from me. I better not meet him in the corner shop. He will be very sorry if I ever do. I don't think he's around very much these days. But yeah, I mean, they tried to provoke riots. They actually got the territorial police in there on the Friday night when there were a lot of people upset. And we had to stop them upsetting people who were just speaking loudly and having loud speeches, because they would have tipped it into bloodshed probably, but we managed to stop them. I'll never forget that night. People needed to vent, and they thought it was going to turn into a riot because, you know what, it was like little Africa down there, a lot of black people, and that's how they saw it, because that's how black people. But anyway, it's absolutely disgusting. Anyway, we did manage to stop them. We held the territorial police back, and people said their piece and then went home. But yeah, it's no, I agree with what you say, Mike. But I do have more hope for this particular inquiry. I'm not giving up on it.
Thanks very much, Emma. So do you think then that people like Cameron or Peebles or any of the politicians involved will go to jail?
I don't think they'll go to jail, but they will be shamed. I mean, for any of those people, it's all about their reputation, isn't it? I don't think, you know, Cameron or Barwell or any of that lot will, but they should be thrown out of the House of Lords. There's no doubt about that, and that will be punishment enough for people like that. With the corporations and some of the individuals that I've been reading about, they will be facing charges. There's no doubt about that.
Well, that's quite encouraging to hear. I'm going to bring in Richard Chilvers.
Hello, Emma. I wasn't, just apologies, I wasn't able to listen to the talk, and so I've come in a bit late, but I have been following the report and listened to lots of the statements. I think it's particularly useful, the statement from the committee on behalf of Grenfell, because they put it in a nutshell. Really, it's the politics of it, have we got a government who's prepared to actually, a government that you called on the Labour government to stand behind the recommendations really and to change things. And obviously that is one issue. And I do agree in some ways with that in fact, in a way, it's a bit of a safety valve and a delaying tactic. But these inquiries are forced on the state. They don't really want to do this, even the ones over the Iraq, over the other ones as well. That basically the state responds by going for inquiries. But the question I'm going to ask you actually is, I cannot see why, to be constructive about in terms of the recommendations, why in fact that the group shouldn't suggest that in fact that all recommendations from inquiries should automatically be accepted by the government and put into legislative form in a bill, so that they could be implemented. I can't see why. I think to use the Crown as a way of stopping this happening, I think that is actually, yes, they will try and do that. But I think there's a way forward for that. And also another question is, which I thought that may be useful, is sort of interim. That in fact we know that Arconic, the architect, some of these individuals were actually guilty, even in the interim report. The first report from Moresby actually questioned. I would have thought that in fact that in terms of future inquiries, and maybe this inquiry will bring this about, that in fact that if there's somebody guilty, then the police should be involved, should be charged well before the end of inquiry, rather than wait for 10 years like it is going to be now, with the police saying that we'll have to read through the documents and then decide who they're going to charge. Personally, I think Eric Pickles, the fire minister at the time, I think his name, I forget his name now, he used to be the Great Yarmouth MP. He was the fire minister at the time, and also Eric Pickles, who was responsible. I mean, the fact that Eric Pickles decided he didn't want to spend too much time in the inquiry anyway. And so, I mean, these people should be pilloried, really. And I think that I would like to be a bit more creative and support Emma in that in fact there may be the group, the Grenfell group, could actually be very proactive in trying to push forward a way of implementing this, because I mean, I listened to the Today programme, and it was actually quite revealing, actually. And they were quite revealing, the BBC, that in fact that recommendations from all over the place haven't been implemented by the state, and that is a failure of the inquiries and a failure of the state itself. So thanks very much, Emma. I'm sorry I wasn't able to listen to your full talk.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Yeah, I support Richard's comments there.
Good, thank you, Emma. So I'm bringing Phil back in.
I think one of the things that we have to know is that these reports are limited, because when they finish, they have no legal powers to continue after that. Once the report of the inquiry has been held, that's it. And it's up to the government then, or the Crown, to decide whether it accepts or rejects what the findings of any inquiry are. Hence, Leveson, which was a crucial one because of all the wiretapping and everything, that ended up nowhere. Leveson 2 was simply ditched, which it was meant to go to come in to finish the job off. That's gone. The Iraq War, well, lots of it was held in camera. A lot of these inquiries, there's a very interesting one where police officers married people in campaign groups. And that's being held partially in camera as well. And it'll be interesting to see how many police are sentenced for what they did, which were obviously criminal acts, where women were essentially raped and by the state. And nothing has so far come out of that. I mean, how anyone hasn't been arrested, I don't know. The other thing I was going to mention was the fact that this idea that they last a long time. Now, Emma, I wanted to ask you, how much pressure was there for the police to go ahead with their investigation prior to finishing this inquiry? Because this 7-year inquiry, followed by N years more police looking at it, It'll take us to 2027, which is 10 years after the events. And this is another reason why I've tried to say what I said about the purpose of inquiries is to bury things. Because by the time, they always happen too late, they're too slow, and they don't have any legal powers of enforcement. It's a way of our government system, it's a way of the government system managing these particular events and crises. Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir. Let's go back to you, Emma.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I find and the process is incredibly frustrating. There's no doubt about that. I don't know. I mean, I'm not one to defend the police, but having visited the Operation Northfield, North something, and seen that they had at one point 100 people reading documents and digging things out and so on. It just the amount of stuff they had to plow through was quite extraordinary. They had literally millions of documents that to go through at one stage, and that was. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I would rather they came when they come to court that they are 100% ready. However frustrating it is, I do understand the frustration. I mean, I've spoken to erosion survivors who want people to go to jail tomorrow. I understand that, so do I. But I want the police to have everything at their fingertips. And I don't know. I think they're trying to do the best job they can. That's my belief. I may be wrong. As for inquiries trying to bury things, well, they haven't, have they? There's 1,700 pages of brutal expose there. So I think, you know, in my opinion, it's the exact opposite.
Thank you very much indeed. I haven't seen any other hands up now. Would anyone else like to come in and ask a question or make a contribution? I can't see any other hands up now. Okay. In that case, would you like to make any concluding remarks, Emma, about the whole situation?
Yeah, of course. I'm onto this.
Richard has now put his hand up again.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
Richard, if you could just make this very quick, please.
Yeah, it will just be a question because I did ask, was part of my question anyway. Basically, how confident are you that the present Labour government is prepared to actually implement anything, really, to be honest? That's just a question, really, because I think, in fact, the survivors of the Grenfell group was a very, very good statement. It put all the onus on the type of government we have, a type of scope, and we know that Starmer is not fit for government, really, to be honest. But they put it, they stuck it in that way. It was quite a very political statement, I think, to be honest, to expose actually what is basically, you know, a government which is not likely to actually. But I wonder whether Emma thinks that, in fact, that we will be able to force the present government to change its course on these kind of things, really.
A very good question, Richard. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think they can get away with it. I really don't. This is huge. The number of people who are affected by it, not only the number of people who are sleeping in unsafe homes tonight, but all the people who have been, who've got rotten councils, the whole housing crisis, the building safety crisis, it's massive. And there are millions of people affected by this who are waiting for results. So it's not only about Grenfell, it's about people right across the country and about failures in national government and especially local government. And any time in the last week of all the interviews that I've done, I've tried to bring it back to failures in local government too, because they implement what national government supposedly decides. And nobody's really interested in the role of local government, which I think is disgraceful, actually. So I'm going to keep on doing it. As for whether or not the government are keen to do that, you know what? They're not going to get away with not doing it. They're really not. It's all the groups that I'm in contact with, not only the main Grenfell group, but other local groups. And there's all kinds of other things about mental health and physical health of people around here. But people believe they're being affected by toxins and so on. That's a whole other story. That's a whole raft, a whole level of disaster that may be approaching people. I mean, we know there are 10 firefighters who attended that night who've got terminal cancer. I think it's 12. 20 firefighters who attended that night who have cancer, and 10 or 12 of them have terminal cancer. And so we're all worrying about ourselves as well, especially the people who live right next to the tower. So there's endless issues. And nobody is going to give up on this. They will not give up on it. They'll be attacked from all angles until everything is dealt with. So I am more optimistic on the coalface here that things will be done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Emma. I also, I read, I don't know how true this is, that the police, with the release of the report, apparently the police have to work under a different set of rules in order to bring about prosecutions. Is that true, or is that just newspaper speak?
I don't know what that means. I'm not sure, I'm afraid. I don't know.
So, I mean, if that's true, then there'll be many more years before the police can actually come up with some charges against the people responsible. But you're not sure, you don't know whether that's true.
I haven't heard that. I have not heard that at all. I haven't heard that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I just wanted to clear that up. Is there anybody else that's got any information on that? Would be very interested. Steve Freeman would like to come back now to give his concluding remarks, and then we can call the meeting to a close. So, Steve, over to you.
Okay, Carol, I'll be brief because we've had quite a long meeting. I just wanted to respond to a little bit to the discussion, and especially to thank Emma for her contribution. I wanted to really emphasize a couple of things that's quite important to our politics, and I think Emma was meeting those ideas perhaps for the first time, maybe, and she's still a bit dubious about them. But the distinction that we draw between the crown and the king. Now, for many people, these two terms are synonymous. Okay, and it's understandable, but we're making the point that the crown has to be seen as really the state, and the king is the head of state. But being the head of state, that's obviously very important. But our republicanism, therefore, is not primarily about, it's not the same as anti-monarchism, get rid of the king. It is very much about democracy from below and the people. And so that's where, and now at the core of the crown, as we've seen, it is His Majesty's Treasury. That is the key institution that isn't mentioned anywhere in any of these stories, but people were talking, I think Emma was, about saving money. What is the drive to save money? And the means of distributing money to this cause or that cause? Where's all that coming from? And the money that's gone to the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and all the rest of it, that is coming from decisions made in the Treasury. It's the decisions made in the Treasury, of course, that are now going to decide that we can't afford to pay the winter fuel payments to the pensioners. That will no doubt lead to other examples of social murder, because some people may die as a result of being cold and their hearts giving out and things of that type. There will be an increase in deaths. So for us, the Treasury doesn't figure in this story, right? And yet it is the overarching, I think, force in all of this. Now, I want to end, Carol, if I could, just by going back to the executive summary in the report, to contrast two things that gets us to the idea of the crown and the people. In section 2.103, it says, in the first week after the fire at Grenfell Tower, the response of the government and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea was muddled, slow, indecisive and piecemeal. The RBKC's, the Royal Borough's, systems and leadership were wholly inadequate to the task of handling an incident of such magnitude and gravity, involving, as it did, mass homelessness and mass fatalities. They're not really that aware of mass homelessness. Now, in contrast, the next section says the following: the response of the community, the people, was very different. The report says those who emerged from these events with the greatest credit and those whose contribution only emphasize the inadequacies of the official response are the members of the local community. With the support of local voluntary organizations, they provided support in the hours immediately following the fire, when the authorities were conspicuous by their absence. Indeed, one of the RBKC's, one of the Royal Borough's failings was to make too little use of local voluntary organisations and to fail to have an adequate standing arrangements to enable them to be called in the event of an emergency. Now, in those 2 points of the report, we have the contrast of the overarching failure of the Crown, which is not a Commonwealth and is not that interested in ordinary people or that, and the community, which is the backbone of a Commonwealth, which has to be the backbone of our democracy and is absolutely central to what Tony Benn was talking about in his idea of a future Commonwealth. And so I will. That's what we need to be thinking about as the left. I mean, I would say that we need to be thinking in that direction. We need much more radical change than we're getting. And this, I think, you know, Emma's right in one sense. I mean, not right, but in one sense, that it's absolutely true. The Crown will bury this report. It's kicking it into the long grass like it always does. But it's also true, the opposite is true, that Emma says, that the people, the community, they will not let that happen so easily. You know, there will be a struggle between what the Crown is trying to do with that report and what the people are trying to do with that report. And so that is the contradiction and the clash. You know, how that turns out, well, we'll see. History tells us the Crown will get its way, not the people. But let's see how it goes. I think, as Emma said, the housing crisis is so important and so big out throughout the whole country that it involves many, many more than the people in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Finish there, Carol.
Thank you very much, Steve. And of course, yes, you're absolutely right. The community is so important. And our vision for a democratic republic is that the community would be paramount. People would have the sovereignty, not the Crown in Parliament. So very, very, very important concluding remarks. Thank you very much, Steve. So it's just left to me to say thank you very much, Emma, for talking to us. It's been wonderful. You've obviously got a very close relationship with this whole horrific tragedy that has taken place. It must weigh very heavily on your soul, I would imagine. So carry on the good work. People are already trying to order your book. I'm getting messages of people trying to order your book as the meeting is going on. So thank you very much for that link. And thank you very much for coming today to talk to us about this horrific tragedy. And let's just hope some people do go to jail. I'm very glad that you're optimistic about that. So thank you very much indeed, Emma. And to everybody else, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your contributions and enjoy the rest of your evening.